Oops. So hi, everybody. Welcome. I hope some of you made it to workshop number 1 in the series, which provides the just an general overview. This session is going to talk about one of the ways to collect data, which is interviews. And then next week, we'll be doing focus groups, then surveys, and then kind of putting the pieces together about how you communicate this information to policymakers and the public, not only for this purpose, for other purposes as well. So I'm going to do a little bit of just kind of a reminder, particularly for people who didn't make it to the first one, talking about community engagement, why it's important, the role of interviews and how their role in public engagement, and then the steps in conducting community interviews, and then some resources and case studies. I saw that, I think it's the last poll I saw was like about 75% of you. This is relevant for your work, so that's great. Please, I do love questions. Go ahead and put them in as we go along. I probably won't get to them until the very end, but it's still good for me to have them as we go along in case I do have any time. So what is community engagement? Why is it important? It's the process of working collaboratively with and through groups of people connected by geographic proximity, special interest, or similar situations. It's really important to understand that community is not just defined by geography, but people who might have a lot in common in some ways. It could be, say, parents, or it could be people who say have cancer, or people who are just interested in some sort of environmental issue or parks or whatever it is. That's who the community is defined in this case. If you don't have community engagement, bad things can happen. There can be mistrust and miscommunication, poor decision making, social fragmentation because the groups have not gotten together to kind of learn from each other and understand each other, and inefficient resource use in terms of both financial resources as well as human resources and human knowledge. So I put this together based on a question that came up last time. And that's sort of basically distinguishing between players, stakeholders, and community members. So players, when you're talking about sort of the political science world, are the ones who have direct control of the decision making. And it's also the stakeholders and the community members, but this biggest circle, this biggest outer circle, are the ones who have that sort of direct control. So here's an example from education. So these are people like the school district leaders, the school district board members, state education leaders, the ones who actually make those policy decisions. So then within that, a subset of the overall players are those who are have stakeholders, or as somebody noted last time, stakeholders can be a politically sensitive term. So you could also use the word interested parties. And that's those who are directly or indirectly impacted by the decisions. So let's say the residents of the school district, even though they don't necessarily have kids in school, local community groups, employers who might be employing those individuals. And those are all considered to be stakeholders or interested parties, even if they're not directly impacted. And then the community that we're talking about in this case are the students, the teachers, the parents, people who are likely to be directly impacted by the decision. Now, it might not be everybody. Let's just say if it was for, say, students who have disabilities, it might not be every single student in the school, but it's at least a portion of those. That definition is going to vary depending on what policies that you're discussing. So this is, basically who we're talking about in this case is the community members. But in the case of interviews that we're talking about today, we might also be talking as well to the people who are in this kind of broader group, the group above, who are the stakeholders and the interested parties, and even sometimes the players, just to make sure that the analysis that we're providing is what it is that they need to make a decision. So we have a spectrum of community engagement. On the low end, it's just basically telling people, hey, we've made this decision, and you're just informing people. And then at the far end of the spectrum is empower, where it's actually really the members of the public, the members of those communities, who are the ones who are making the decisions. And so as you go along the spectrum, you have greater levels of community building, community engagement, and what it is that you do. And then you'll see here in blue are all the different ways that you can collect information. And what we are doing today is the interviews, which are like about the middle there between in the collect and involve section, where what they call here in this case stakeholder interviews. And when they're talking about stakeholders, they're meaning both what we would call, what I have in my chart there as the stakeholders, which are people other than the people directly impacted, those who are also indirectly impacted, plus those who are directly impacted by whatever the policy decision is. And we will use both of those groups, as I mentioned, in our interview process as we are figuring out how to conduct it. So what are interviews and what role can they play in community engagement? So community interviews are a way of collecting data from community members through structured or semi-structured conversations. So a few things I like to focus on. So it is not just a conversation where you're just like talking to somebody, because that from a data collection standpoint, that's not going to be particularly useful for you. You'll get some insights, but it's not, if it's not collected the same way with each person you interview, it's going to be very hard to synthesize that information together. So what a structured interview means is that you have a list of questions, a list of topics that you'd like to talk to the stakeholders about. And you're going to go through each of these different questions. It's a very small number of questions. When it's semi-structured, what that means is you have your questions, but it doesn't mean you can't go beyond those questions. Just as an example, one of the things so I am based in Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. What I teach is what I do as a consultant. And one of the interviews, I have done or was looking at people who are unemployed in Pittsburgh, right? And so when I talked to these individuals for the study I did, I had a list of questions that I would ask at each time I interviewed somebody. But if they said something, for example, like, well, what is your barrier to getting a job? And they might say, well, I needed to join the union, but I didn't have the fee to get into that union, right? So I'm gonna drill down further. Like, what was the barrier to them doing it? Is it that they obviously they didn't have the money, but did they talk to the union? Could they not get a scholarship? I want to know a little bit more about why they were facing that challenge and what they did to try to solve it, and what policymakers and like either help them or deter them. So to do that, I'm going to have to go a little bit beyond just the questions that I have in the interview. But I do want to ask the same questions of everybody in the same order. And that is part of the structured interview. So community interviews are important because they are part of multiple ways to collect methods. And I remember talking to this professor at Penn State one time when I was doing this kind of work in DC. And he said, well, look, Debbie, no data is perfect. No data collection is perfect. But if I have a couple of studies and I've done it different ways and they all are pointing the same direction, then even though I have a high level of uncertainty, I have confidence that collectively I'm making the right recommendation to the policymakers. And that's why this is called this data triangulation, where I'm going to have multiple ways to collect community information. Today, we're talking about interviews. In the future, we'll talk about focus groups. We'll talk about surveys. You also might have other things. You might have, town meetings where you get communities together, all these different kinds of activities. But the key is you want different data collection methods, doing it different ways, and that if all those together are giving you the same message, then you're going to have greater credibility. And what you will also find, like in this last sentence, is that quantitative data alone is not enough. Because the challenge with quantitative data is that it doesn't tell you enough information to make a decision. It tells you there's a problem, but it doesn't tell you what the community thinks about the problem, how it can be solved, what challenges they face with existing policies, what the opportunities are. To answer that, you're going to need to have qualitative data, not just quantitative data. But you still need the quantitative data because, you're going to want to know if you implement these policies, you want to know in 5 years, is the situation better or worse? And for something like that, you're going to also need quantitative data. But today we're just talking about qualitative data. Okay, so why conduct community interviews? So the first is that everybody has like a lived experience. And as I was mentioning in the previous slide, is quantitative data alone won't capture those lived experiences, and you can get those through interviews. It also helps begin to build trust and understanding between the government staff who's conducting the interviews and the community members, and it helps them feel part of the decision-making process. The other thing is it can really help you get diverse perspectives, because one challenge with, say, the town meeting, public meeting method is that it tends to bring in the same sort of people. But, if you're a mom with 2 kids and who works full time outside the home, and you have to get the kids to soccer practice and get food on the table, things like that, going to a town meeting is like a real challenge. So the problem with the sort of group meeting context is that you're only going to get a certain sort of people, and you're not going to get other people. Or like the study I was talking about last time in West Virginia, we're talking with people who do not have internet access. So if you do something, let's say some sort of digital poll, and you have people who don't have internet access, then that won't work either. So what you really want to do is target your population. You want to make sure that you cover all the different perspectives that will provide the information that you need to make the best decision. The other thing that you can do is you can identify community partners for future activities. So an example I was mentioning with the people unemployed, the way that was set up was by working with the leader of a community group. So I interviewed first the leader of the community group, and then asked them to identify people who they thought would be good if I interviewed who were unemployed, right? And so that's also another important aspect of community partners is of community interviews, is to start to build those relationships with those community partners so that they can help you with future activities. And that includes not only things at the sort of the beginning, but also the end. So when the study is released, if they might be willing to host an event or spread the word. It's like, to say you are doing a survey, they might have the population that you need for those surveys. So that's another important part about community interviews. And even though I talked about an organization leader, in some places, it's not necessarily an official organization leader, but people in that community know who their leaders are. And they might be doing it on a totally volunteer basis. And they would say, oh, so-and-so is leading that particular effort. And the other thing you can do is sort of brainstorm community-driven solutions to whatever the social challenge or opportunity is. It's good to not have just the thoughts of the government staff, but what do the community think should be done? Maybe some great ideas will come out. Maybe by working together, it will make sense for them to like certain ideas will emerge as to what it is that they think should be done. So here's examples of the role that community interviews can play in state and local government. They can be used to evaluate current policies and programs, identify and evaluate new policies, develop a community involvement plan. So community involvement plan is like all the different pieces, so, and I'll show you some of these later, or it might be town meetings, interviews, focus groups, talking to like different leaders on a more one-on-one basis. All these things, community interviews can help you develop that full plan, not just be a component of that community plan. You'll learn about community needs, resources, and the preferred communication channels. Like I mentioned, this can vary a great deal. When I was doing some of the focus groups, for example, we would give people, say, grocery cards, at our local grocery charge like just say $20 or something, so they could participate. So if it's very possible that your community members might say, like, look, I'm willing to help, but I really can't do it. And you need some sort of economic incentive to help pay for their time in helping you out to meet whatever their need is. You also understand community expectations, and then you can gather information for planning, policy, or technical assessments. Let's just say you want to understand how many people have mobile phone access before you, say, implement a program. Okay, so key informant interviews are sometimes a good place to start. So these fall more into the stakeholder category. Both those category means, by that I mean those are both directly impacted and those are indirectly impacted. And so these are qualitative, in-depth interviews with people who know what's going on in the community. It can be community leaders, professionals, or residents. So for example, if it's a public health program, it might include doctors, nurses, community health workers who may or may not actually live in the community where they're providing support, but they do know the community that they're working in. And they are not, say, community members, but they definitely are key informants about the community. And because of this, they are often a good first place to start. And what they can do is provide insight on the nature of the problems, possible solution. Sometimes, particularly in a private setting versus a more public setting, they can be more candid. They can discuss sensitive topics. You can look and get a better understanding of their background and opinions, and avoid inhibiting group dynamics. So oftentimes individuals, it might be like a person alone, or might be somebody like just maybe one or two other people, certainly no more than three people. The key informants interviews, you can start to really kind of gather the information to set up your interviews that are more with the more general public, the people who are directly affected. So the steps in conducting the interview, we start out with the purpose and goals, then identify and select the interviewees, develop interview questions and any scripts, recruit and train the interviewers, schedule and organize the logistics, conduct the interview, document, cluster the responses, analyze it, write the report, and then, very important, follow up with the people with whom you interviewed at the very beginning. So I'm going to go through each of these steps, and you'll see here at the bottom of each, I have an AI prompt, which can help you with that particular activity. So first, how do you define your purpose and goals? So you start with whatever your originating documents are. The first is sort of what law put your program in place. Now, it's amazing how many people never look at those policies, but whether or not you're a public health department or environment or energy or housing or whatever, it's always good to go back and look at the mission and goals that were set up when your department was established, and even to go down a level to your specific program. It's good to find those, know those, because you always want to keep that in mind. That's sort of the big picture. That's why the public and policymakers put that program in place in the first place. So know those and make sure that you think about those as you are developing the purpose of whatever your program is. And then once you have that, you want to supplement it with any issues that have arisen. So it might be things that have come from the press, maybe in the public, maybe you've gotten some feedback sessions, so maybe some informal conversations. Maybe you have a common survey or something that you use every time somebody comes to your center, whatever it is. And then policymaker discussions. So, your policymakers, your leaders might be out there in the community, might be talking to, say the head of your department might be talking to the member of Congress or the mayor or the city council, whatever. So you want to know what those issues are. And then once you have the issues that you're going to address in the survey, you want to test them out with your organizational leaders. That's very important because you want to make sure that in the end, they are your audience typically for whatever analysis that you're doing. And you want to make sure that they eventually will get the answers they want. You don't want them to come back later and say, hey, why didn't you ask about this? This is like the biggest issue. I have people stop me on the street and talk to me about this every day. So you want to get their look at it. And even though they might say, oh, yeah, no problem, whatever, at least you can always say, hey, I talked with you and you didn't mention that to me before. And say, oh yeah. So they don't blame you for not including whatever it is. And then another big factor in interviews is thinking about what to do about confidentiality. So that's going to vary a great deal. So some areas like, say, public health, and some maybe say education are much more sensitive than, say, other issues like, say, I don't know, a library collection policy or whatever it might be. So you really need to have some decision as to how to manage confidentiality. You might already even have a policy in your department or in your city or state or whatever on those kinds of issues. So make sure that those decisions are made early. And so when you contact people and ask them about the interviews, they will know what the status is. Most of the time for the work that I do, for example, I do not promise confidentiality. What I do is I'll say, I will not connect your name with a comment that you made. But part of the reason I want information on them is to show that I talk to that particular group, right? So if there's 10 different perspectives on an issue that I'm working on, I need on my side for, say, a client I'm working for to document that I have gathered all those different perspectives. So I would like to list their name and information about them in the document, but not connected to any comment that they might make. So everything is de-identified in the analysis that I do. But everybody's different. I always check it with any client that I work with. I will ask them, how do you want to handle confidentiality? So exactly the same aspect. So here's an example of a prompt that you could use to kind of help you get started on this. Act as a community engagement specialist. Help me clearly define the purpose and key objectives for a series of community interviews about whatever topic it is you're talking. What should be our top 3 goals be for our interviews? So before this, I might have given background information, or I might attach background information to help this, like all the stuff I've talked about before, the originating documents, maybe there's news articles, anything that I have, I would have that as input for this prompt to kind of give whatever it is. But you really want to make clear, again, what the topic is. What is the ultimate decision that's going to be made? So the second part is about identifying and selecting interviewees. So what I typically do is begin with sort of the list of key informants. So these again are the community leaders, the people who are both directly and indirectly impacted. They're kind of the easy ones to identify. And you know, my goal is to recruit them early in the process, develop my interview questions, and then pilot those questions with them. And I will tell them this, these are the draft questions. If I'm working with a client, I'll say, out of the people you'd like me to talk to, give me the ones who are going to be the easiest and fastest to contact and who are most likely to agree. It's so important, I cannot overemphasize this, to pilot your interview with those people because I always make changes. I always have to make like minor adjustments. Sometimes there's sensitivity that I don't know about. Like in the last um, webinar, we talked about the use of stakeholders versus interested parties. There might be things like that that are particular sensitivities you do not know about. And so it's really good to begin with your key informants and test things with them. And then the other thing that you can do with your key informants is you can ask them to identify other key informants and community members that they think should be part of your endeavor. And even better is if you're in a situation where you can request they make that personal connection between you and the new interviewees. And that's another good reason why it's useful to use them for your pilot test. Because they can say, oh yeah, don't worry about it. I spent like 15, 30 minutes with this person. It was easy peasy. And you sort of have that connection. And that will increase the likelihood that other uh, people who are key informants, community members will actually respond to you and agree to participate in the interview. So you do this for all the interviewees that you have. This is called the snowball method, where you just start with one person, say, oh, well, who else do you think I should talk to? Who else do you? And then you'll get a reasonable population, hopefully, of people. The other thing I often do is who disagrees with you? And they'll know who disagrees with them. And I'll say, okay, well, those are also people that I should do because I'll be on panel discussions together or, they'll be at community events or meetings or things like that. So you might be surprised that the people who are like for whatever issue it is, they definitely know the people who disagree and are quite willing for you to, connect with them, talk with them, and so forth. So here's an example of a prompt. Lists the types of community members, leaders, and organizations we should consider interviewing to ensure diverse perspectives on whatever the issue is. Suggest strategies to reach underrepresented groups in our community. So the next step, again, some of these are a little bit overlapping, but it'll kind of give you uh, uh, it's as stepwise as I could get it. So now you want to develop your interview questions and your script. So when you're starting out with any interview, you want to explain the goals of the study and ask them like what they think. Is this a useful study or not a useful study? That's important to know um, because that gives you an idea about how much they care about whatever the topic is. Hopefully they'll say yes, but if not, you just kind of like move on. But it's good for them to sort of hopefully say, yes, this is important. That's why I'm participating. So begin with something easy, some easy kind of warm-up questions. So ask them about them personally, how they're involved with the community, anything that you can think of that makes sense. That like how often do you go to the library? How do you use it? Things like that. Things where they're talking about themselves as opposed to their opinions. Then you want to prepare 5 to 10 open-ended questions, non-leading questions. That's very important. But that means don't tell them how you want to answer in the question. And you want to do it so you get some meaningful responses and then have probes for deeper exploration, sort of like I talked about earlier, like follow-up kind of questions. So by open-ended, what that means is you do not want yes/no questions. Um, so this is also something where ChatGPT can often help you because you might not even realize it, but you definitely don't want a yes. and that's it, or a no, that's it. You want to write it in such a way that you get a fuller discussion. And then when you end, you want to ask if they have any additional thoughts, and then ask them if they have any additional questions. So that's the basic structure of an interview. Uh, Hopefully you would not have to ask demographics, but sometimes you do. And try to avoid, however, doing age or income. Sometimes it's good to just have the demographics separate from the interview, in the sense of like maybe you just, like you're done with the conversational portion. Maybe you just give them a card or something and just say, can you check off this so we have the demographics for whatever it is that you're doing. But definitely consider about if you're going to collect demographic information, um, and if so, how are you going to do it? So our prompt here is draft 8 open-ended questions, open-ended unbiased interview questions for community members about your topic. The questions should encourage honest feedback and cover strengths, concerns, and ideas for improvement. Okay, so you're gonna have to recruit and train interviewers unless you're gonna do it all yourself. With in my case, since I'm a solo entrepreneur, I pretty much do it all myself. Um, it's really important though, if you do have to have multiple interviewers, that you all are on the same page, because otherwise when you come back, your data is going to be very different. So if you do have to have like multiple interviewers, it's really important that you all be on the same page. You want to train them on active listening, appropriate dress, respectfulness, and cultural norms of the community. As somebody who's worked with, say, students, for example, graduate students on this kind of stuff, I cannot overemphasize how important this is. Um, Always try to emphasize that you're being neutral. In other words, you're not like yes or no on whatever it is you're talking about. You're just there to listen to what it is they have to say. You might have to, emphasize this. I might say, well, what do you think? I say, oh, that's not my job. I'm just here to listen, right? Practice with mock interviews. And then this is a prompt. Create a brief training guide for staff who will conduct community interviews, include tips on building rapport, active listening, asking follow-up questions, and maintaining neutrality. Okay, then you want to schedule and organize the logistics. So this can be a pretty big issue these days, asking interviewees their preferred communication mode. So some people, you can do it in person, but other people say, I don't want somebody in my house, or I don't want to have to go anyplace. So they would prefer to view it by video, but of course video doesn't work for everybody. So that might be by phone. So that's something you really have to think about. To me, always the best way to do this is leave it up to the interviewee to pick the method where they would like to be used. Maybe it's, maybe they'd like to say, well, let's just meet at the local coffee shop or something like that. Whatever it is, that's what it is that you do. You want to have platforms for e.g. scheduling and rescheduling. Things happen. It's important to keep that in mind. You want to ensure accessibility for all. So that for this might be language issues. It might be some sort of disability, whatever it is. You're going to need to think about that. So here's a prompt: generate a checklist of logistical steps for organized community interviews, including outreach, scheduling, location selection, and accessibility. Then when you're actually conducting the interview, you want to start with something similar interest, whatever it is that you can see or observe, like, oh, do you have kids? Do you have a dog? Start talking about dogs. Oh, what's the latest sports thing, whatever it might be. You want to have a welcoming, respectful environment. You want to introduce yourself, your role, the purpose of the interview, and talk about confidentiality. You want to listen more than you can speak. And here I have, like, again, 2 sample prompts. One is for a script and an interview introduction script, and one is for about follow-up and probing questions. So then one of the questions you need as interviews is whether or not you can record the conversation. So in my case, most of the time, I will always ask if I can record. I've never had anybody turn me down, but you do always have to ask. And in some cases, like I said, for sensitive issues, you definitely don't want to record. Again, you might have a government policy on it. You kind of need to know what that is for your organization. I always take detailed notes regardless of whether or not I'm recording, because that allows me to highlight things, and you never know if the recording is going to work. And then you also want to, like, if somebody has a really good key quote, that's really good to have, because you're going to want to maybe use that later. And so you want to try to get that down verbatim. And so this prompt is about a template for summarizing and categorizing community interviews by theme. You want to really do all the stuff as you go along. Don't wait until the end, because then your memory and so forth is going to decline. So do it each day, right after the interview, or definitely no later than the next day. Then you analyze and summarize information, identifying main patterns, highlighting actionable steps. You want to make sure you discuss it with others. So not only your team, but it's really good to go back to those initial pilot interview respondents, the ones that we talked about in step 1, and say, well, here's kind of like what we have. How does, what are your thoughts on this? So really try to involve them in the process and get that feedback early. Again, don't wait until the end. And then here is a prompt about summarizing the community responses. So I did something actually about community engagement activities, community benefit agreements. I interviewed a bunch of people. I collected information. I compiled it all together. I put it in and I asked certain questions. To, whereas I just didn't like have it summarize everything. I said, well, what do they think about this or that, or whatever it might be, going back to whatever categories of information my client was interested in. It generated information. It wasn't perfect, but it's close enough for me to have like a first draft. I asked it to always include the quotes that they based that categorization on, so I could see if I agreed or disagreed with that analysis. So like I said, it wasn't perfect, but it got me like at least 50, 75% of the way there. And that obviously saved a lot of time. Again, I should say, add to that point, this is all anonymous data at this point. So it's all been de-identified. So then you write your report. This is basically acting as a public policy analyst, but it could be anything, whatever position it is that you're in. Use the following interview notes and summaries, draft a comprehensive report. And then you put in the interview notes. Now, this may or may not work as a first draft, but I always find that even if I like write the whole draft independently, and then I have the ChatGPT or whatever write their version of the report, I look at the two and say, oh, I missed this. And then I might take it from the ChatGPT version of the report to my version of the report. But I've never used a prompt to write a report from beginning to end. But it doesn't mean I can't have it write its own report, and then I can develop insights from that. Or maybe take my report and the ChatGPT report and then ask it to do a comparison to say, well, what's missing? What are the differences between the two? And then I can look at those differences and say, oh yeah, I guess that was true. I missed that. And then I can incorporate that into my report. Okay, and the last one is to go back to the interviewees. So I think it's really important not to just give them a big report, but to develop a separate summary that's no more than a single two-sided page, ideally with graphics, that you want to share with the interviewees. I also like to label it as a draft so that they know that it's not locked in stone, and give them like a few weeks to give some sort of feedback, ideally where I might have a second conversation with them if I can talk them into it. Then incorporate that feedback into the draft before it becomes final. And then I have my final report that goes to the policymakers. So here's a prompt about drafting a follow-up email to the community interview participants. Okay, so now we're going to attempt steps. I'm going to provide some resources and case studies. One question that we have for you that I hope you will provide an answer to in chat as we're talking about this is that one thing we're thinking about is as I identified, like last time I talked about the Denver case study. Here I'm going to talk about some other ones. we're thinking about maybe having something in the fall where we bring people in from some of these real world cases, where I could kind of interview them, ask them a few questions about how they did things, and then open it up for questions from all of you. So if you think that would be a useful activity for us to do in the fall, like a yes or no in the chat would be very useful. And then also, if you have any case studies that you would like to suggest, maybe even at your own organization, that would be great, because I will tell you, it was hard for me to find the case studies that I'm showing you here. And in general, I think it's also useful, but it's always really good to go from these generalities to things that are more specific and see how people actually did it, the challenges they faced, what they would do differently, that sort of thing. So please go ahead and put that into chat, so we can plan it for the summer, for the fall, if this is enough interest. So okay, so this is a useful document I found from New Jersey. It is from this Trustee Institute. What I liked about this one, I just have an excerpt of this, but they have, for community resources, they made a list, and it's much longer than this, it's several pages long, of all the different community organizations that that they thought should be considered when their analysis, this case was community leader interviews. So I thought this would be a good brainstorming list for you guys to look at when you're putting analysis together, to say, oh yeah, I forgot about those people, or things like that. Because lots of cities have these same kinds of organizations. Then this is also a good example when you look at this document, because you will get these slides, you can click on the link to get it, the process they provided for community leader interviews. So it's an example, if you're setting up a process for your own organization, might be how you do it. This is a sample script of them calling community leaders and asking them to participate in an interview. Notice that they sent them a copy of the interview questions and met with them, thanked the person, and kept keeping them informed. And this is an example of the questions that they asked. You see that it was like 7 questions. They started about, tell me about the Spanish-speaking community in Fair Oaks. See, again, a nice general warm-up question. Then they got into substance. What are the major needs, issues, problems, and so forth. And then at the end, like 5, who else should we contact? Is there anything else you'd like to say? What questions would you like to ask? This is a really good example of the design you would want to have for an interview sort of question. Sorry, using the interview method for collecting data. And then what they did, which I also thought was good, was they set up a follow-up interview within 3 months. And then, try to say, like, get their help in marketing, getting their input on the preliminary action plan. So I thought this is a really nice document. I was quite impressed with this. Simple, but also not at the right level, as opposed to something like super fancy. Something that anybody in this audience, I'm sure, could do. This is from UCLA, and it is, again, focused on key informant interviews. I thought that where I felt this document might be useful for you is talking about how to compile and organize data. So this is something that you really do have to think about. And so they have a whole section on this. And then you'll see here also talking about some of the disadvantages of interviews, like it might be selecting the right key informants can be difficult because of diversity issues. It can be challenging to reach and schedule interviews, and it can be difficult sometimes to generalize results. And I would say all of those things are true. This one is from EPA, and the reason I included this is because it talked about how many interviews you should do. So this is something about site selection, and they said about 15 to 25 interviews. So I will say that when I have done community interview kind of activities, it has always been around that 15 to 25 level. Though I'm going to show you one later where it's like 10. But the number of interviews are going to be related to the level of depth of your topic. But this to me seems about on the right order for what you would want to have. And I put the list of attachments on here because they have actual scripts for things like a sample scheduling call, confirming letter, things like that. So again, a good starting point for you to develop your own, just sort of see what they put together for this EPA activity. So here's an example of something. This is from Boulder, Colorado, and it was about something related to an airport. It's like where a current airport was, and they were trying to kind of give the sites. And I gave this because you'll see here at the bottom, this gives an example of all the different activities they did, which is 2 citywide open houses, 2 citywide online and in-person questionnaires in English and Spanish, a community working group, bilingual community meetings, and individual interviews. So it's a good example of how interviews fit in, sort of with this picture. Then there's this, they had the full report. So here's, oh yeah, no, this is also in the summary report. This gives all their schedule of activities. It gives an idea about how they handle feedback. And then this is a more in-depth report. And it is, you know, quite long, as is the case might be. And they have this like very hard to read table, which I've noticed is the same thing with the Denver study, which also very hard to read tables, but they are interesting. So I did some clips from this. So you can see here how they anonymized the participants, but they still gave information about who they were in a general sense. Then they summarized the content, what it was that they said. And then they categorized it. So this is an example of what I was talking about, where you want to kind of like begin analyzing the information as you go along. Here is something that this was done by the University of Missouri, but it was required, something that was required by statute. And so it was done for Boone County, Boone County, I guess, paid the university to do this kind of report. That is something that's not uncommon to do. And so again, if you are somebody you think, oh, we just don't have the resources in our city community, you can, there's probably some sort of school of public affairs at your, university in the state that you can reach an agreement with and have them do it for you. And you'll see here again that they have an inventory, they have synthesizing document, and in the end, they pick 10 key informants. And what's important here is that the 10 key informants were determined by their board. They did not determine it themselves, so the people who were doing the analysis. And then here's sort of how they summarize the information in the more kind of in-depth report that they had. Here we see it here. And this was like, I can't remember, like 50 or something pages long. So you can have a summary report and a more in-depth report that puts together this information, gathers together the data, and so forth. They did not provide the list of questions that they asked, which kind of surprised me, but sometimes it's optional whether or not you do that. Generally, I would provide the list of questions that I asked that were at least part of the structured interview. Here's another thing. This is in Arlington. This is something called the Arlington Unity Council. So you notice they had 3 town halls, 8 public meetings, 15 focus groups, and 30 one-on-one in-depth interviews. And what they did is they used the quotes for the actual report. And I put this clip in here about quotes that this report are drawn for interviews. And they noticed here that basically they said, hey, these are not, that they did light editing. And I will say, I also do light editing on quotes because you don't want people to be sort of embarrassed. Even when I do like transcription, you do have to sometimes do enough light editing so it makes sense while still maintaining the quote. If I really feel I've done a lot, which I generally would not do, then I'll go back to the person. But most of the time, it's things that are like, relatively obvious, where they, like I said, you would say, or things like that. They would not want that in their quotes. So, but it's always good to acknowledge whatever it is. And you'll see here, it says, findings from our one-on-one interviews often reveal impassioned, spirited, and insightful comments. To be completely honest, some of the people we spoke with, I felt undervalued and overlooked. Here's some of how they highlighted the quotes in the report. And in this case, they did, like I said, these 30 interviews. And it was part of what it is that they did. Oh, good. I'm at the end because I'm out of time. The last thing here, just a kind of reminder of all the different things that I have going on. If you're looking for job openings, like if you want to let people know you have job openings, then please let me know about them so I can put in my newsletter, an opinion newsletter. I also have right now this mini workshop going on, this on policy analysis. All this stuff is for free. And that is the end, I believe. Yes. Okay. So thank you.